Okay, the question is, why do VO2 max training if World Tour pros don't have a high VO2 max? And I think this is something like we see this a lot that we'll see stats thrown out about a World Tour pro and the fact that maybe they don't have a super high VO2 max. And so why should we train VO2 max? Well, there are World Tour pros who have a very high VO2 max, but then there are some who have very, quote, average VO2 maxes. So what we know is that a measured VO2 max is not necessarily a predictor of performance or ability. You can be an extremely elite rider without a super high VO2 max, which is really cool because it means that in this particular area, your genetics do not necessarily predetermine your ability or the level at which you can ride, which is always kind of fun and exciting to think about. But when I prescribe what we often consider to be VO2 max intervals, kind of anything over threshold, especially in that like 3 to 5 minute duration, you can think of it as working on your 3 to 5 minute power, surge power, whatever you want to call it. You will get to and train your VO2 max by riding over threshold for long enough. If you ride over threshold at I've talked about this before, it's called the VO2 slow component. If you ride over threshold for any duration, for long enough, even at 101% of your threshold, you will get to VO2 max eventually. It might take a really long time, but if you're riding over threshold because of the VO2 slow component, you will eventually get to VO2 max. But you're also just working your power production at that duration in the power curve. So that's one element, and there is value in that, depending on, your goals and your strengths and weaknesses and that sort of thing. But the larger piece here is that is something called fractional utilization, which is the premise that your FTP effectively has a ceiling, which is controlled by your VO2 max. And so if you think of it like for most well-trained riders, their FTP will be somewhere between 85% of their VO2 max power. Now, I've talked before about how VO2 max power doesn't really exist. It's semantics in a lot of ways, but if you think about as your FTP is kind of capped by your 3 to 5 minute power, that's if we're dealing with semantics, that's a more appropriate way to think about it. So you have to raise your VO2 max in order to raise your FTP. If your FTP can only be 75 to 85% of your 3 to 5 minute power, if you raise your 3 to 5 minute power, well, now 75 to 85% of that is going to be higher. So VO2 max controls how high you can get your FTP. And we do know that World Tour riders, despite whatever their VO2 max, their measured VO2 max may be, they do have very high FTPs. And so to the extent that VO2 max controls how high you can get your FTP, that is why it's important to train.